Just the threat of government violence in Libya was enough to prompt Western military intervention. But the killing of hundreds of civilians by Syria's government has drawn little more than lukewarm rebukes from Western governments, and now a half-hearted statement from the UN Security Council. Is anyone willing to stand up to Bashar al-Assad? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Now, the UN Security Council has adopted its first clear condemnation of Syria for its continuing crackdown on the protests. This after the army continued to advance into the city of Hama. But the condemnation came in the form of a statement, which in the world of international diplomacy is little more than a slap on the wrist. A tougher measure would have been to issue a resolution, but there wasn't enough support within the Security Council for this. Critics say the UN statement will do nothing to slow President Bashar al-Assad's strategy of attacking his own protesters. Well, let's just compare the differing approaches applied to Libya and to Syria. Now, on Syria, the UN said the following. The Security Council calls for an immediate end to all violence and urges all sides to act with utmost restraint and to refrain from reprisals, including attacks against state institutions. But the UN Resolution 1973 on Libya took a very different position. It expressed, quote, its determination to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian-populated areas and the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian assistance and the safety of humanitarian personnel. Well, let's discuss the relative merits of those two approaches with three guests today. From Paris, I'm joined by Haitham Mana, the spokesman for the Arab Commission for Human Rights. And in London, we have Nabila Ramdani, who's a Middle East analyst, and also James Denslow, a security analyst at King's College London. Thank you all for being with us today. Nabila, let me begin with you, if I might. And let me begin by questioning our own basic premise here. Are the two approaches to Libya and Syria at all relevant? Are we measuring apples against pears in that comparison, or is it a suitable analogy?
Well, I think the international community's response to the uprising, both in Syria and Libya, has exposed a double standard in its response and has exposed the blatant, of course, there is a discrepancy between the kind of response which the international community took with regards to Libya.
Well, that's what we're saying. I mean, there is a discrepancy. I'm just wondering whether perhaps the discrepancy is best explained by the differing circumstances in each country. I mean, are we being fair to the Western community in expecting them to behave exactly the same in Syria as they did in Libya?
In my opinion, it is very clear that the international community, and especially the hawks in the Libyan conflicts, which are France, Britain, and to a certain extent the US, have seen the uprising in Libya as a window of opportunity to intervene. It's also very clear that under the cover of the protection of civilians, there were far more to it. For example, it is no secret that the leaders of the National Transitional Council in Libya are negotiating with the French about oil contracts, lucrative oil contracts. They are discussing contracts with French companies like Total and Shell. And that is even before we've seen an end to a military conflict. So it's very clear that the intentions of the motivations behind the intervention in Libya have more to do with securing the interests of the West rather than the protection of civilians. Well, and we've seen it even more clearly as the conflict unfolded in Libya.
That is one interpretation, and one that we'll touch on a little bit later. But what they actually said in going into Libya, the way they phrased it, the way they justified that action, was on humanitarian grounds. They said they were going in simply to protect civilians. Haitham, do you think that was the actual motivation? And do you think that same motivation should be applied to events in Syria?
I think that we must separate completely the example of Syria from Libya. First of all, because of the dictatorship of the Security Council and the idea of veto. Secondly, because now Libya is a bad example, not only for some members of the Security Council, but also for the Syrian people. For that, I think that it is the maximum that we have today with a statement, and we must search a new initiative from 3 countries, India, South Africa, and Brazil,
before we do that, let me just ask you to
relationship.
clarify your first 2 points. Firstly, you talk about the dictatorship of the Security Council. Please expand a little on what you mean by that.
I like to say that all ideas about reform of the Security Council in the 19th of the last century was failed, and up to now one country is enough to stop any initiative for a good resolution about Israel, about Syria, about Iran, about any countries. This is our problem. For that, we must have another issue. We must think that we can do something in the Human Rights Council. We must contact all the other institutions, regional or international one.
But the point at issue here is not necessarily the politics
Council.
of the UN, is it? I mean, at issue here is the very simple question of, do those people in Syria who are doing nothing more than peacefully taking to the streets deserve a measure of protection from the international community?
Yes, we need more protection, but the problem is that nobody now can take it from the Security Council. Our problem is that we need it, and we must take our initiative which can touch directly Damascus, which can directly touch the president and the government, because these people had an idea that Western countries is against them and they cannot discuss with them. For that, all people which have another position, like third world countries, must take initiative to influence the Syrian government and the Syrian president. If not, they will continue with this security option, destructive and repressive one. We pay a very hard price of this choice, and we mustn't stop in New York or Washington. We must think that there is another way to influence the Syrian government.
All right, a number of political issues that come up in this conversation, many of which may be tangential to actually the events on the ground. Let me, if I can come to you, Robin, and ask just to stick to the actual problem here and now, and that is the violence that's taking place in Syria. Just what's your perspective on what we said so far? And is that population in Syria deserving of some measure of intervention?
I think it's an important starting point to remember that the Syrian opposition, as fragmented as it is inside and outside of the country, has asked for there to be no intervention at this stage. I think it would be very easy for the regime in Damascus to use the threat of foreign intervention as a means of buttressing its own legitimacy. However, what we do have is somehow a unanimous statement at last from the UN after months of negotiation and an 8-hour closed session in the last few days. This could make a difference on the ground. We don't quite know yet. Ultimately, the protesters in Syria are the key to determining what will happen there. They're currently under the cosh in Hama, and I think there's 3 quick, clear options as to what will happen next. One is that they are cowed, the protesters are scared off the streets, and the rebellion is put down. The second is they choose to take up weapons against the government, and you had a road towards a civil war. And the third option is that the soldiers taking part in this attack decide not to actually shoot and kill their own people, and they defect. And essentially we have what we did in Egypt and Tunisia, where the regime is turned over at the top.
But just to go back to your initial point, I mean, you're right, the opposition in Syria and the people within Syria have, to a large part, expressed a desire not to see foreign troops coming into the country. Having said that, though, you know, let's not avoid the issue here at hand, and that is that they are being slaughtered by their own government. So if I can just ask you to speculate for just 1 second on this. At the end of the day, what we're asking here is, should there be more than statements in the UN here, even if what we anecdotally, and let's not forget that there is no real consensus here, what we anecdotally say is a desire not for intervention. If we assume that these guys did want us to intervene, do you really think that the UN or the US or Britain or France would actually take action?
No, and I think the UN is a partly broken institution in the sense of its ability to enforce its own principles. The responsibility to protect, I think, is what you're alluding to, which is a concept that has been developed within the UN. Ban Ki-moon himself wrote about it in the last 2 years. And I think within that, we've got the idea that there is a responsibility from the global community to stop these things happening. However, that takes away the actual politics of the Security Council and the veto, as you mentioned. I think it suits both protagonists, the West and the sort of less progressive countries in Russia and China, on the UN, that they don't have any form of military intervention. Britain and France are pretty much full out in Libya at the moment, and there's no public appetite for further intervention. Meanwhile, the Russians, while they say that the reasons they're not supporting any serious resolution is because of what happened with the resolution in Libya being stretched, ultimately they are very close allies to the Syrians. They have a deep water port with the military being using in Tartus. They have oil and military contracts. I don't see why the Russians would want there to be a regime change, one of its closer local allies.
I wish I was talking about the responsibility to protect, and I wish I could, so clearly as you have just done, actually outline what appears to be a fairly rational policy. But the problem here, surely, and let me put this to you, Nabila, the problem here is not the issues really that Robin has raised there, but the fact that they apply different foreign policy theories to every event that they come across. And this is essentially, once again, coming back to the nub of what we're talking about here. We can explain what's happening any number of ways, but at the end of the day, the problem is that people are still being killed.
Well, very much so. I think it's important to remember the grounds on which we went, the international community went to war against Libya. As you said earlier, it was essentially to prevent an onslaught happening in Benghazi, essentially. The international community ended up in this absolutely ludicrous situation, and absolutely, dare I say, criminal situation, where it made it its mission to lead the rebels to outright victory by breaching all sorts of rules, including arming the rebels, and indeed, as we've seen over the last few days, backing up terrorist elements, including al-Qaeda. The rebel leader in Libya admitted that there were al-Qaeda elements within his groups. So we intervene on the basis of the protection of civilians, and we end up backing up rebels after all these efforts put against the war on terror, to which Gaddafi, let's not forget it, cooperated fully with the United States, and in particular with the CIA, to defeat terrorism in Libya.
So your position is fairly clear on this, is that Libya got special treatment simply because of Gaddafi and the way he is seen in the rest of the world, and as an ancillary issue, because there happens to be a lot more oil in Libya than in Syria.
Very much so. But we, having said that, although it's very clear that there's no appetite for the UN to intervene in Syria in any shape or form, I'm not saying that there should be a military action in Syria, and that military action should necessarily be the answer in Syria. We've seen that the mood is changing. The words of Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, basically calling al-Assad inhuman, are very strong. He also said that the people responsible for the killings on the ground should be held accountable. Washington also changed its tone by saying that al-Assad is not indispensable to the stability of the region. So that's a very strong statement. And the French Foreign Ministry also said that there's a major turning point in the international community's approach to the killing in Syria. So I think there's a shift in the position of the international community in Syria, precisely because it exposed the hypocrisy of the international community.
But the international community also talked of less violence from the side of the protesters. They have tried to hedge their bets in a number of ways. Haitham, in Paris, let me ask you, I mean, despite your criticism of the UN as a body, do you think they should be playing a role in this event? And do you think what they have done thus far conforms to their responsibilities?
Our problem, if you like, today is that Assad is indispensable. It's right. But he is enough strong to attack 3 cities in the same time. And this is the problem. The problem that the army is able now to attack people and to attack civilians under the order of the president, the actual president. And we must try to find a political solution. We cannot accept this attack against civilian in a part. In other part, we cannot still also in the level of denunciation. We need really a political solution. For that, I contacted many countries to go to Damascus to try to influence the Syrian government, because we need it. We not need to stop this aggression against Syrian people, against civilian. If we still in the level of sentences like legitimacy of this regime or no legitimacy of this regime. I don't have any legitimacy for this regime since 11 years. But now I need to stop repression against my people. This is my problem. And this is what I can try to make with another initiative, another political initiative, not only inside the Security Council.
All right, James, let me come back to you in London and first of all apologise for having called you Robin on the previous occasion. It is James Denislow. But let me broaden this out for just a second, if I could, and forget the events of this week and the past 5 months in Libya and Syria, and look at the broader picture here and how the region has been moving in the past 20 years. Because back in before the days of George H.W. Bush and Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the US's approach to the Middle East was pretty much a hands-off attempt at maintaining a balance of power, of playing off the local powers against each other and maintaining stability in that way. And since then, we've seen I guess ultimately expressed by George W. Bush, the jumping in with both boots and trying to just reshake up the entire regime. I'm just wondering, that arc of history over the past 20 or so years, is that arc what has brought us to this point, not simply this Arab awakening that we keep talking about in the past year or so? Is everything that we're seeing today a function of history?
Well, of course, but I think it's a big question. I think you've got to look at certain dynamics in terms of understanding the transition to where we are today. Clearly, during the Cold War, the dynamics in the Middle East were essentially seen through that prism, and I think that limited the role of United Nations and other international bodies, and everything was seen in the light of which side countries were on. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the demise of the Soviet Union, the ability of the Americans to project power into the centre of the Middle East via the Iraq wars that kind of came up to 2003, the idea of sovereignty has fundamentally changed, and that, I think, is what the debate today is about, liberal interventionism and the responsibility to protect. Are countries sovereign within their own borders? Can they do whatever they like? Or is sovereignty earned? Is it earned by the actions you have towards your own people? Now, of course, people in Britain will find it absolutely horrifying, the prospect of tanks surrounding Birmingham, British tanks attacking British people in Birmingham. It's simply it's mind-boggling. Yet in the Middle East, the regimes that are running certain countries have been able to get away to a certain degree with this ability to control and kill their own people and not really be held to account. And I guess the question is today, is the international system, if it's not the UN, maybe it'll be the G20, able to handle and cope and react to this current dynamic?
Well, I was thinking more along the lines of, and maybe let me put this to you, I was thinking more along the lines of perhaps one of the reasons why we're not going into Syria right now is because the US and much of the Western alliance has suddenly woken up to the reality that Syria could be the last straw. Any semblance of stability in the Middle East will be utterly destroyed if the Libyan regime falls right now, or if there is more concerted action within Syria, I beg your pardon.
Well, in fact, to the more general question, I would contend that the American foreign policy has in fact been very consistent over the last few decades in serving its interests first as far as foreign policy is concerned. It has never been really interested in promoting a democracy in any parts of the world. That's what it says on the paper. That's the rhetoric of the American administration, whatever it is. But the reality is very different. It has always, worked extremely hard to overthrow even democratically elected regimes, like in Iran, for example. And let's not forget that the Obama administration is already rewriting history as far as the more recent Arab Spring is concerned. There was no show of support in the early stages of the Tunisian revolution. There was no support in the early stages of the Egyptian revolution even. Same thing in Libya. We've seen the reactions as far as Syria is concerned coming very, very late indeed. And the support of the Americans have always come extremely late in the uprisings in those various countries. So to say, it's for the Obama administration now to say that they have always been, that it has always fully supported pro-democracy group is simply and utterly a rewriting of history.
All right. Well,
and in the end, there's, if I may add, there's a certain arrogance from Western power to keep picking and choosing the right person to rule countries in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Haitham, let's get back to the current situation we face. And you spoke about the problems in Syria right now. And if we do see an end to this regime, a change to this regime, what is the likely outcome of that? How are things going to pan out following the end of a Bashar al-Assad regime?
I think that the regime don't have any future. The old regime is already died. But the future and the transitional period is very difficult, and it will be so hard for the Syrian people. It will not be easy. For that, I think that we must take on consideration balance of power inside the country and all our capacity to mobilize more than people than now. Because up to now, power is able to mobilize a part of the population, and there is also the silent majority which is still looking without any intervention for a real change in the country.
But the balance of power within the country is basically what the president has been worried about, or claiming that he's been worried about. If he departs and is no longer able to hold everything together, is he right in saying the country will fall apart and we'll just see sectarian violence throughout?
I think that now we are in a very crucial period, because up to now he can find many people with the actual regime, because they are afraid. They are afraid of cow. They are afraid of civil war. They are afraid also of a radical change of regional alliances, because in Syria it's not like Egypt. Here we must change all our regional and international alliances. The old regime has had choiced Iranian and Hezbollah and Hamas and many alliances in the region which are not able to continue.
Okay.
We will not in the other side, but we must have another politic toward all of these countries to have a real equilibrium between our neighbors.
All right. Last 2 minutes then, the same question to James and Nabila. James, I'll start with you. What is the likely outcome of what's happening in Syria?
Well, currently it's a battle between courage and fear, the courage of the protesters and the fear trying to be reimposed by the government, not just in terms of tanks attacking cities, but also the fear of what is the replacement for it. I think it's in their interest to talk about sectarianism and chaos, and of course the people of Syria will have seen such chaos on their borders in the east in Iraq and in the west in Lebanon. I think ultimately it's about the regime, whether it chooses to drag the country down with it, whether it can offer enough carrots at present to quell the silent majority into supporting their continued rule. But I think whatever happens, Syria will never be the same again. And the last word, Nabila, to you.
Well, I think you cannot murder your way out of trouble, which is what the al-Assad regime is trying to do at the moment. And if you try to do so, then there's no turning back, and that's why the new measure, the new proposal put forward by the al-Assad regime as to allow opposition political parties to exist is being perceived as not being credible at all. So it's very hard to see what can come out of all this in the next few months, dare I say. But
it seems. It does seem, though, that at the end of the day, the UN statement doesn't seem to convince anybody that there's going to be much of a change thanks to that. We're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all our three guests. In Paris, Haitham Mana, in London, Nabila Ramdani and James Denslow, for joining us on this programme. Also, thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Well, that's it for now.